Hello and welcome to this Social Stories webinar, which is brought to you by Techability, part of NatSpec, and the Carton Network. We're very pleased today to be joined by Carrie Sant, who works for Fitzroy, and she'll explain a little bit later about what she does and how it ties in, social stories tie into her work. As we're going along through the webinar today, you should see on for most people, it'll be on the right-hand side of their screen. If you haven't moved it, there'll be a chat window. That's your way to interact with us if you like, and you can post any questions in there. So any burning questions, please type them in as we go along, but please bear with us because we might not respond immediately to those questions. We might save them to the end or a suitable point in the webinar. If you're struggling with your audio or anything sounding unclear, the best thing to do really is to log out of the webinar and then log back in, and that seems to solve most issues. So without further ado, let's crack on. I'm just going to introduce, before we start, Techability as a service. So you know why we're here. Apologies if you know this already, but Techability was set up by NatSpec and the Carton Network to make sure that staff working in specialist services and specialist colleges had access to professional development opportunities. So we also consult with staff on their assistive technology delivery. We develop and produce national and regional events. We kick out quite a lot of webinars like this and develop some online resources. And another thing that we try to do is influence and input on behalf of the sector. So we've got contacts in government departments and with other national organisations, and we're trying to really up the profile of assistive technology in charities and in education to make sure it's firmly on agendas when people are making decisions at a higher level around technology, that they don't just think about technology as being a one-size-fits-all solution. So what's coming up in the next little while? There's a few more webinars, an AAC and GDPR one, which might be interesting to some if you've got individuals you work with who are using communication technologies. Medical devices is fairly specialist, but again, if you're working with people who need medical devices, then the regulations are changing, and travel training's a really big thing for people. Often this is seen to be something in education, but it's really something in life skills training as well. So there's a lot of technology that can support that. And then our big event on the 3rd of November in Birmingham is the Techability Conference. Last year and the year before, these have been really successful events, even though I say it myself, but as an organisation, it's been great to get loads of people in the one room, all who are looking towards the same goals and learning from each other. So there's details of all of those things on the Techability website on your screen. So the program for today, we're going to talk about why we would use social stories, and then the rest of it is divided into paper and digital, as with a lot of things in life nowadays. We'll be talking about why we might still use paper, even though we're talking about assistive technology overall. We still need the technology to produce a lot of the paper resources. And then the digital resources, looking at some usage and some apps. So let's crack on then. In terms of time, we'll probably go through for another half hour or so until we're complete. And as I say, any questions as we go along, please just type them in to the chat box. So I'm just going to hand over now to Kari. She can introduce herself, and she'll let you know a bit about what she does.
Thanks very much, Phil. So obviously I'm Carrie. I am an assistive technologist working with Fitzroy. So Fitzroy are a national charity supporting people with autism, learning disabilities and acquired brain injury across supported living, registered care and day services. And my role is to look at how we can use assistive technology as part of the support that we offer. So that might be around promoting someone's independence, maybe helping them in the kitchen to prepare their own food, looking at things like environmental controls or communication aids that will give them the opportunity to make choices more easily, and obviously looking at things like telecare as well around health and safety. Phil, if you could just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So why use social stories? Social stories can be used in a wide variety of ways. They've been around for approximately 30 years now, and I think their use has kind of changed and developed over that time. But some of the main ways that we use them at Fitzroy, and I think Phil agreed that these are quite relevant in his sector as well, are around transition. So that could be changing environments such as a home, or it might be changing from school to college. It might be a new experience. So for a lot of the people that we work with, they might not have been to the hospital before for a certain type of appointment or a procedure, so that can be quite new for them. But it might be an everyday experience as well, so something that we might take for granted, so going to the dentist or to the doctor. And there might be changes in home environments as well, so that might be around family members, it might be around the staff that are supporting the person, and again in the school environment as well, those changes can take place from time to time. And then it might be around understanding life experiences as well. So for some people that might be changes such as the loss of a parent or another family member, or illness, anything really that kind of is new and unusual or potentially unexpected for the individual. Phil, if I could have a new slide. Thank you. So why use paper? As Phil said earlier, this is around assistive technology, but it's as much as about the low tech as it is about the high tech sometimes that we found, and there are many benefits of using paper over the higher tech things such as apps, and one of those is the lower cost. So once you've invested in that initial purchase of the software, the actual resources themselves are quite low cost to produce, to print, and then to replicate or reproduce if they're damaged or lost, so they're quite easily replaceable. They don't need to be charged, they don't need to be updated, and they don't need to be connected to Wi-Fi. So this is something we come across quite often. We might go to use an iPad and it's not been charged, or the software needs updating so it's not available at that moment in time, or for a lot of our services the Wi-Fi isn't always brilliant. So actually, as much as an iPad might seem like the best option initially, sometimes it's not the most reliable, and it's not always going to be available when you need it. And then paper can be used more easily in a wider range of environments. So sometimes we might not want to be looking at using an iPad somewhere like a swimming pool or just out in the community in general, depending on the individual. And that low cost paper resource might actually be more suitable. Okay, thanks, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. So we thought we'd just move on to show now some examples of paper use and why that might be, where they might be appropriate. I was just thinking back to Carrie's example there of paper in the swimming pool. Of course, we trust that you're all familiar with and friendly with a laminator to be able to do things like that. And taking things out and about in the environment, the laminator can be your best friend, even if it's just a shower of rain. Carrie, I'm just going to ask you if you could talk to the next couple of examples, really, as these are things that you use in Fitzroy, about how these were constructed and how they might have been used in particular settings.
Yeah, so for a lot of the people that we support, as I mentioned earlier, they can find things like going to the doctor or to the dentist quite worrying, and then that itself can result in some changes in behaviour which then needs to be managed. So sometimes we'll use social stories as part of our behaviour support and our just general support for that individual. So for example, we've had a few people who maybe haven't been to the doctor or the dentist in quite a few years, so we would look at doing some practice at home with them, some, stuff around kind of having your blood pressure taken maybe and that sort of thing in the home environment. Then we might do some preparation visits, but we'll use social stories as kind of part of that approach. to go through the process maybe with someone, what they're going to expect. And it means that the staff can go back to that information quite regularly with the person. So this was an example that was created in Boardmaker, with the intention of it kind of staff being the people who will be reading the information alongside that individual, and the images are there to support the text and kind of lead into each section. And that would have been kind of, like I said, done in that process in the run up to getting someone ready to go to that appointment that they were quite potentially anxious about beforehand. And then another way that we've used them in the past has been around helping people to manage their social interactions. So not always, but sometimes people might not get along particularly well with the people that they're living with, and obviously there's different ways of managing that, but we might use social stories as part of the approach. Again, it's just around helping someone understand that situation and what reactions might be appropriate. So in this particular example, if you've got someone who can be quite noisy when someone else is trying to watch the television, it's helping that first person understand why they might be doing it and what they can do in that situation to help them cope, so what the coping strategies might be and what they can do to help them feel better about that situation.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. I've chosen a slightly different example, and this has been made in SimWriter or Communicate in Print, similar packages. And this is more specific about a specific visit that someone's going to have for an immunization. And as you can see, the structures are slightly different, and we just wanted to make sure you're not thinking that social stories have to be in a particular layout or a particular pattern. So obviously Carrie's stories are using the picture to cue the individual in to what's happening with the text, and the text might be read out to them, or they might be reading it themselves. But other people might need a lot more support about the structure of the sentence and about the individual words themselves, if their literacy needs are a lot higher. So you can see this one's about immunization, and it's about the specific process that that person's going to go through. I would always say, though, still, that if someone's working at this level and they need this amount of symbols, they would at least, on the first couple of occasions they were reading it through, need someone to go through it with them. Any symbols often will often need explanation and some sort of, there's no guarantee that someone's going to have the same understanding of a symbol as a different person. So these are relatively easy to make, these ones, but as you can see, it's a very different structure just to support someone through that maybe one-off engagement with a healthcare worker. So how do we make these? We're thinking about how the pieces of software, we've mentioned a couple already, because it's very hard to talk about the theory of these kind of things without talking about the software that we use to make them. And there's three key bits of software out there that are getting used heavily, both, as I say, in education and in charities, and by parents and anyone who supports an individual who needs these kind of social stories. So we'll just go through them one by one. Boardmaker is ubiquitous really in special education, and it does get used in a lot of other settings as well. And that was used to make the resources that Carrie showed you first. All of these essential packages will essentially do the same thing. They enable you to put a picture or a symbol in a certain place on the page, and they enable you to put some text in a certain place, and then you can print it out or you can see it on screen. But mostly they're designed for creating printed resources. So Boardmaker has been around for years and years in various guises. It's quite expensive as a software package. So you can see there 245, that's your basic price if you were just buying a single user license, or there's various subscription models, check on their website for the various pricing models. But the big advantage Boardmaker has is that it does have over 30,000 symbols, and these are frequently updated. So if something happens in the next few months and a new prime minister gets elected or a new president of the USA, then they update the symbol set to reflect that. Another key example that happened is that the way that mobile phones have changed over the last few years, and they've been changed from being lots of buttons to being touchscreen. Well, if they hadn't updated their symbol set, the word phone, the picture would be totally different. Disadvantages, obviously, of Boardmaker, it's quite expensive, especially if you're in a small organization and don't have a lot of resource, and it may have more features than you require. So think about it as an option if you're making these resources, but it may be that there's a lot more in there than you need. SimWriter 2 it's called, because there was something just called SimWriter. This again, this is probably used a lot more in education than it is outside, because it was originally designed as a literacy support package. So you type words and a symbol will appear above those words. So as we saw in the example before, it's good to not have a symbol above every word, but just have key words highlighted with the symbols. This is a fair bit cheaper, $149 for a single user license, but again, there's different models if you're in a bigger organization. SimWriter is really straightforward to use. That's one of its big advantages. You can pretty much just open it up and start typing. I would suggest you don't do that. I suggest you're a bit more cautious and make sure you're using the right symbols and minimizing the symbol use just to the key ones. But it is really easy to just get started with. The downside is it only has the widget symbols, which, as I've said, they're designed more for literacy support. So it's not as black and white as this, but sometimes you'll find that the symbols are quite narrow. They don't represent a whole concept or a whole description of something, whereas in Boardmaker they use PCS symbols and they're more designed for communication. So bear those things in mind when you're comparing packages. The third one is a bit of an outlier, hasn't been around as long as the others, called Matrix Maker, and this is made by Inclusive Technology. Again, a lot cheaper than Boardmaker, but very, very simple to use. Comes with lots of pre-made templates and examples that you can just tie into. This comes with two different sets of symbols, the symbol sticks and the widget symbol set. So you've got quite a lot there. I can't find a figure of how many, but there's got to be a good few in the 10,000s, I would think, probably higher. The disadvantage of this is a little limited in terms of how you lay out things. If you're happy to lay things out in a grid basic, a grid layout, or just straight lines, or what typically looks like a document, if you want to be a bit freer with your layout and move things around the page, it can be a bit tricky to do that. You have to work with it. So apologies, no kind of straight answers there as to which is the best, but as with anything, it all depends on context and it all depends on the kind of resources you're creating for your users. So I'm going to hand over to Carrie now, just to talk a little bit about the disadvantages of doing paper resources, creating paper resources.
Okay, so there's not a massive amount of disadvantages to paper resources, but one of the key ones is they're not always as appealing to the user. So especially for maybe younger people, something like an iPad and an app obviously always look shinier, it's more appealing to them, and a paper-based resource might not always be the route that they want to go down. Another downside is that you can't just make changes as you go. So for example, in some of the apps we're going to talk about later, if you needed to change something there and then in a situation, it's fairly easy to just do that within the app. Whereas obviously with a paper-based resource, you just go find a laptop, a computer, make the changes, reprint, and obviously relaminate. So it's not that easy to just make changes as you need them. And obviously you can't use dynamic content such as videos either. So within the apps that we're going to talk about, you can use videos as well as images, whereas obviously that's not possible with paper-based resources.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. So we move on now to thinking a bit about why we would use digital over paper, and Carrie's kind of summed it up there, but just to reiterate, the dynamic nature of using some of these resources on a tablet just means if you need to edit them, so if you're on your way, you've created a resource and you're on your way to, I don't know, the gym or the swimming pool, and you find out that it's closed for some reason, and you need to make adaptations to that story, you're able to do that as you go along. You don't have to get back to the printer. So it does make them a lot more dynamic. You can also have the advantage of putting audio into those, so either having it spoken out by a digital voice, like a robotic digital voice, or you can record that in yourself. And that can sometimes be used really effectively by the individual. If they're using the story as a support themselves and stepping through it, there might be occasions when they need to communicate with someone, say at a desk, and they can also use that as a bit of a speech output if they're unable to make that request themselves. And also going one step further, you can put video recordings in. So in order to support complex tasks or concepts that might be needed, then putting a little short video in can save having to make 5 or 6 pages worth of step through documentation, just having a short 5 or 10 second video. I wouldn't encourage people to put massive long videos into their social stories, because I think that's meeting a different need, but really short clips can work very, very well. So we're going to move on now to think about some examples of digital use and which have been used in real settings. So handing back to Carrie, she's going to talk us through a couple first off.
Okay, so this was an example of a trip to the dentist that was made in Pictello. So depending on the individual, depends on what types of images you might want to use. So this was quite a specific one. This is going to the person's local dentist, so local, you know, you'd want a photo of their reception that they were going to see and the waiting room that they were going to go into, and ideally you might even try and get a photo of the dentist themselves so it's a familiar face. And there is quite a lot of text with this one, but for other people you might obviously want to simplify that a little bit more and have a little bit less information to go with each image. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Bill. So this was an internet image of the dentist peering into someone's mouth, and again, just that nice clear stop symbol at the end to kind of reinforce to someone that if they're not comfortable, if they were feeling any pain or anything like that, it was okay to ask the dentist to stop. That one was fairly straightforward to make. Pictello was really easy to use for that one. Moving home, so this one was to support a transition for someone. So we do have people who occasionally move properties within our services or who might join us. So this is quite a nice opportunity to talk someone through that process, and it's just around giving someone the opportunity to see, you know, what's going to happen. So an introductory image of the new home and the boxes being packed. And then if you go on to the next slide, Phil. And then obviously the following stages of all the boxes being packed away into a van and unpacked again. So again, for some people it might not be appropriate. That wasn't an ideal image, the one on the left, to use, but it was just the one that was available at the time.
Okay, I've got another example here. Again, this was made in Pictello, of more of a step through process. So this is used for a particular individual who was needed to use the foot spa for medical reasons, but was really unsure initially about how they would use it or getting their feet in. So it started off as a familiarization exercise so that they could go through the steps just on a screen as to what would happen, and then each one of these steps was gone through individually with the person, with the end goal that they would be completing a lot of these tasks themselves and doing it fully independently. So it served two purposes really. It looks like a bit of an instruction manual, but the primary purpose started off as familiarization, and then it moved on to just basically being an instruction manual, so that the person using it got everything in the right order. There were a couple more slides that I've missed out about that you'll be pleased to hear, that about cleaning the foot spa and making sure it's properly put away and things like that. So it doesn't always work out, I think, with social stories, that sometimes the way you envisage it's going to be used, the person who's using it will sometimes come to a different arrangement themselves. And a good example, I think, is what I talked about earlier about maybe having some audio output, that sometimes people might end up using that for communication as well, and that's fantastic kind of dynamic use of the resources. So just talking around now, thinking about some of the apps, we've mentioned some again already that we used for digital social stories, and we're going to talk through 4 different methods of doing this. This isn't the be all and end all. There are other apps out there, but these are the ones that we've got experience with. And the first one that I've never used myself, but I've seen used very effectively in a college a while back, was someone was just using their own iPad and the photo album on the iPad, and taking some photos in the right order to familiarize someone with what might happen in a particular setting, and then they would sit with that individual and talk through them as a social story. Now, that person's literacy was really low, and they needed a lot of explanation around everything, but it worked really, really well for them, just having the photos. And it worked well for the staff supporting that individual, because there was no apps to learn, there was no complexity, nothing needed to be downloaded. It just all took place in the tablet, and that could easily happen with a phone as well, and work really well. A big advantage of that is it's free, it's built into the device already. A disadvantage, I would think, is that if you need more than one story on that device, you're going to have to do some juggling of particular albums and managing those to make sure you get the right story at the right time, and that all the photos are in the right order. Could be a bit too easy to shuffle things around accidentally. And obviously the disadvantage is there's no text, which in the example I talked about didn't matter, but for some people that might be an issue, that they need that as a support. So Kari, Storycreator. Are you still there, Kari? You were going to talk a bit about Storycreator.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. My microphone was on mute. Sorry. Yeah, so Storycreator is a free app for the iPad. It works fairly well, so it's quite straightforward to upload images and insert them. There does seem to be a bit of a delay, so if you are downloading images off Google to use, they don't seem to appear in the app particularly quickly after you've downloaded them, so it can take a bit of a while to kind of do something from scratch. But it does import them from the camera quite quickly, so it's fine if you're kind of using real life images. The audio runs alongside the text, so as you're moving through the story and the audio is playing, it does highlight the text alongside the audio. I did manage, though, when I was creating one story, to get that out of sync, and then found it fairly impossible to do anything about that to change it, short of deleting the whole story and then starting again, which, being that I was at the end, would have been quite frustrating. So it does seem to have some downsides, but it does have some really nice in-app features. So you can, there's some features where you can kind of interact with the image, you can draw on it and things like that. So if you've got a user who might want to interact with the image as they go through the story, so for example, to draw a circle on a certain part of the image to highlight it, that can be quite nice as well. But for a free app, it does what it needs to do.
Okay, Pictello, I've used extensively for years, and it really is one of my go-to apps for things like this and for multiple other uses. The big disadvantage that you can see there, the cost, it's $8.99 per copy per use, and I think when we're used to paying 99p for apps and things like that, that can seem like a lot of money. I think it's worth it because of the simplicity of it. If you're wanting staff working with individuals to be creating these resources themselves, and as we talked about, editing them as they go along, possibly when they're sat on a bus or something like that. It's really quite simple to do, and you're, in a sense, you're paying for the simplicity, you're paying for the thought that's gone into it, and the well-made app. The other big advantage that it has is if you type text into a screen to go underneath a picture, into a slide, if you like, then tapping on that, the text will be read out to you in the computer's voice, in a choice of voices that you can get on the iPad. But none of the other apps we're talking about do that. So if that's important, you need to think about that. And again, that makes it a bit quicker to make things, because you're able to just type what you need and then not worry about having to record it as well. So if that outweighs the cost, then that might be the app for you, but obviously you've got to weigh up those two things. My Story 2 is another one. It's been around for a while. You can probably tell because it's in version 2 now. This was created by the Open University, specifically for creating social stories and for people to be able to make their own stories and record things they've done during the day, things like that. It's free. It's really good. It's really quite simple to use. Again, the audio needs to be recorded rather than have a digital voice speak it out. But the other big advantage My Story 2 has got is that you can use it on Android devices. The other two that we've mentioned are iPad only at the minute, and I can't see that changing in the short term. So if you work somewhere where Android devices are already used, this is probably the app for you. Or if you're working with an individual who's got an Android phone and you want it to work on their phone so they've got it with them all the time, then this will probably be the way to go. And it's free, so you can give it a try. I think that kind of sums up the apps. Carrie, did you have anything to add in terms of weighing up the usage of these against each other?
So I did, at one point when I was first kind of starting to use the apps, I did do a direct comparison. So I created the same social story in Pictello and in Storycreator. And I did find Pictello much easier to use. So it's got a really nice setup guide which takes you through step by step. And for someone maybe who's not as familiar with using these types of apps, that could be really useful. And as you said, it kind of automatically puts in the audio for you, and it's just a much simpler package to use. So I would say it's definitely worth the $18.99.
Okay, right, that's some really good feedback, thanks. That's good to know you tried to do the same thing in both, and very scientific approach, I like it. So I'm just aware as we're going along, Vic's asked a question about what programs we've used to create the social story. So I hope that question's been asked as we've gone along. Vic, if you've got anything specific to add to that question, please just fire it into the chat. Kari, you were also going to carry on and talk a bit about what are the possible disadvantages of digital.
Yeah, so obviously you've got the initial costs of purchasing the device itself if somebody doesn't already have one. So if you've got maybe a new user who doesn't already have a smartphone or a tablet, there's the cost of purchasing that device, which itself can also be quite costly to replace. So we have had a few incidents where iPads and smartphones get damaged quite easily, and that's obviously not as easy to replace as a laminated piece of paper. As we talked about earlier, it's not always suitable for all environments or all weather situations. So if it's a particularly rainy day, for example, it might not be the ideal time to be taking an iPad out and about with you. And for some users, we do tend to find as well that an iPad can be a little bit distracting. So whilst you might be intending to use it as part of a session to look at the social story, the user might prefer to use it for what they would normally use it for, which might be things like games or accessing YouTube or going onto the internet, or just generally things that might be considered a little bit more fun in their perspective. So sometimes it is nice to have something that's kind of solely used for that purpose if that's going to be an issue.
Great, thanks for that, Carrie. So really to summarize, because we're reaching the end of the webinar here, but to summarize what we've talked about so far, we're really saying that social stories can support people to prepare for new events and experiences, and we hope that you've seen some of this in practice, or the reason that you're here is that you're wanting to introduce social stories in your setting. So I'd encourage you to crack on, and I've seen great results from individuals who you might not even think were typical candidates for something like this. So often it's seen that you know, it's people with autism or people with processing difficulties, but what I've found is that people who sometimes you might think are getting a good grasp of things, just having the visual images alongside the text and the explanation can help to really narrow it down and focus their mind on what might happen, and they might not be able to process all that information in verbal form or just in written form. We're also saying that neither paper nor digital is best. It's about picking the best for that person and that context, and also that it might not be one or the other, it might be both. It might be that just for a certain context or a certain situation you need paper or you need digital. So don't choose one over the other, it might be you need both. The other point to make is that cheap or free can often be good, and it's well worth trying all of the cheap and the free stuff out, but make sure that you've got an eye on quality and make sure you've got an eye on how efficient things are. If people using especially the software or the apps, if they're using them and it's taking a long time to get things done and they're getting frustrated with them, then it's not very efficient, and it is worth thinking about spending some money on some software which might be more effective. So that's us for the content of the webinar today. If you have any questions that you've saved for the end, please feel free to fire them in now, and we'll leave a couple of minutes to do that. I've put any contacts up on the screen if you want to get in touch. If you've got specific questions for myself or for Carrie, please just use the info@techability.org.uk email on your screen. You will get a follow-up email to say when the recording of this is available. So please just share that with colleagues if you think it's relevant, and have a look on the Techability website for future webinars and future events. If you don't have any questions, I don't see anything. We have just some thank yous popping up. That's great. Thanks for attending, everyone. And we have one question here. I couldn't find my story too, but it may have been changed to our story, which I found on the OU site. Yes, Rachel, apologies. I think you're right. I think that's my old brain. In the when it first came out, it was my story, and then it was changed to an our story. That might be more inclusive. Do you think, is that right, Carrie?
Yes, I think it is our story. I didn't spot it on the slides, but now that someone said, I do think it is our story.
Okay, that's good. Thanks for that, Rachel. That's well picked up there. Okay. So I think then there don't seem to be any more questions coming in. We'll draw this to a close. Thanks for attending, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks very much.